There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside a wealthy home when something has gone wrong. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shatter windows or tip over furniture. It simply settles into the curtains, into the corners of rooms that cost more to furnish than most people earn in a year. It waits there, patient and cold, until someone walks in and feels it, that absence where a presence used to be. Dolores Reyes felt it on the morning of October 14, 2019. She had worked for the Hargrove family for 11 years. Every Tuesday, every Friday, 7:15 in the morning without fail, she would let herself through the iron gate at the end of the long gravel driveway, use her key on the heavy front door, and begin her work in the quiet way that good, faithful people do their work, without ceremony, without complaint, moving through the rooms of someone else's life as carefully and respectfully as a person can. She called out that morning the way she always did. "Hello? Anyone home?" Silence. She made coffee. She wiped down the kitchen. She gathered laundry from the hallway hamper and began folding it in the warm light of the mudroom. And then she walked into the master bedroom. And she stopped. The bed was made. Perfectly made. Military corners. The pillows arranged just so. The duvet pulled smooth and unwrinkled as fresh snow. In 11 years of Tuesdays and Fridays, Dolores Reyes had never once arrived to find that bed already made. That was her job. That was the first thing she did every single time: pull back those heavy curtains, let the light in, and make that bed. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she set down the laundry basket very slowly and looked around the room. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was out of place. The reading glasses Richard Hargrove kept on his nightstand were there. His novel, a dog-eared paperback thriller, was there, face down, marking his page the way he always left it. His cufflinks were in the little crystal dish by the lamp. Everything was exactly as it should be. Except him. Richard Allen Hargrove had been born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, in the autumn of 1967. Not the Bridgeport of sailboats and garden parties, the other Bridgeport. The one of double shifts and stretched budgets and the particular pride that comes from never letting anyone see you struggle. His father worked at a packaging plant. His mother cleaned office buildings on weekends. They were not poor in the way that makes newspaper headlines. They were poor in the quiet, invisible way, the way that teaches a child early that the world is not designed with them in mind, and that if they want something different, they will have to build it themselves, brick by careful brick, with their own two hands. Richard built it. He had a gift, not for charm, not for the easy social grace that opens doors for some people, but for numbers, for patterns, for seeing, in a dense tangle of information, the single thread that, if you pull it just right, makes everything else fall into order. He could look at a financial model the way a musician looks at sheet music, not reading it so much as hearing it, understanding its rhythm, knowing immediately where the notes were wrong. He earned a scholarship to UConn, then a graduate degree from Wharton, then a junior analyst position at a mid-sized private equity firm, where he worked longer hours than anyone else in the building and asked for nothing he hadn't earned. By 35 he had launched his own firm, Hargrove Capital, out of a modest office in Stamford, Connecticut, with one partner, 4 clients, and a conviction that he understood how to grow money in ways other people hadn't yet thought of. He was right. By the time he turned 40, he had made his first $10 million. By 48, that number had grown to something closer to $47 million, and it was still climbing. He married Vivian Cole in the spring of 2001. She was a former marketing director, composed, intelligent, the kind of woman who could walk into any room in the world and belong in it immediately. She had a memory for names and faces that bordered on supernatural, and a warmth that felt entirely genuine because it was. They had no children. They had the estate in Crestwood Hills, a condo in Miami, and a sailboat named Patience that sat in its slip most of the year, rocking gently in the harbor, waiting for an owner who was always too busy to come. Neighbors described Richard as a quiet man. Focused. Not cold exactly, but contained. The kind of person who chose his words the way a carpenter chooses his tools. Deliberately and only after thinking about what the job actually required. He coached a little league team one summer. Showed up every Saturday in khakis and a polo shirt. Took it seriously in the way that suggested he had never quite let go of the boy from Bridgeport who had wanted more than anything just to belong somewhere. He brought orange slices for the kids. His accountant of 9 years, a careful, soft-spoken man named Dennis Cho, would later describe Richard Hargrove in words that have stayed with me since I first read them. He said Richard was the kind of man you assumed would always be there. Solid, he said. Like a building. Buildings, of course, can fall. And on some morning in mid-October of 2019, exactly when nobody knows for certain, Richard Hargrove walked out of his life and did not walk back in. Dolores called Vivian at 9:30 that morning. Vivian was in Boston, attending an interior design conference she'd had on her calendar for months. She listened to what Dolores told her, the made bed, the silence, the absence, and she was not immediately alarmed. Richard had mentioned, she said, that he might have to leave early for a work trip. It was not unusual for his schedule to change without much notice. He was a busy man. He moved through the world on his own rhythm, and she had long since learned not to read alarm into every deviation. She told Dolores not to worry. She thanked her. She went back to her conference. By noon, Dolores had finished her work and gone home. By 6 o'clock that evening, Vivian was back in Crestwood Hills. She walked through the house slowly, taking in what Dolores had described. The quiet. The stillness. The black Mercedes sitting cold in the garage. She called Richard's phone. It went directly to voicemail, that recording of his voice, careful and businesslike, asking the caller to leave a message. She made dinner. She ate it alone at the long dining table, the candles she'd lit throwing soft shadows across the room. She told herself there was an explanation. There was always an explanation. By 10 o'clock, she called Stuart Fenn, Richard's business partner of more than a decade. Fenn said he hadn't spoken to Richard since Friday. He'd assumed he was taking a long weekend. He didn't seem worried. By 11:48 that night, Vivian Hargrove had run out of explanations. She called 911. Her voice on that recording, and I have heard the transcript if not the audio itself, was not hysterical. Was controlled. Measured. The voice of a woman who understood that falling apart would not help her find her husband, and so she did not fall apart. She stated the facts. His car is here. His phone is off. He has been gone since at least yesterday. I don't know where he is. Officers arrived within 20 minutes. They were kind. They were professional. They took her statement, walked through the house, noted the absence of any obvious signs of disturbance. They told her gently that these things often resolve themselves. That there were many reasons a man might step away without notice. That she should try to rest. She did not rest. Within 48 hours, the Connecticut State Police Missing Persons Unit had taken over the investigation, and a detective named Carol Mancini had begun doing what good detectives do. She started pulling threads. Mancini had been on the job for 12 years. She was methodical in the way that some people are methodical about their faith, not because someone told her to be, but because she had seen over and over again that patience and precision find things that urgency and assumption miss. A colleague once described her, in a profile I came across, as allergic to coincidence. That seems right based on everything that followed. She started where investigators almost always start, with the person closest to the missing. With Vivian. And what she found in those first careful days of examination looked troubling. 3 months before Richard disappeared, his life insurance policy had been increased from $2 million to $8 million. Vivian was the sole beneficiary. In the weeks before his disappearance, Richard had made a series of small, regular cash withdrawals. Nothing dramatic. $400 here. $600 there. But consistent, the kind of pattern that looks, to a practiced eye, like a person quietly building something without wanting anyone to notice they were building it. And then there were the phone records. Richard's personal cell phone, the one that went to voicemail when Vivian called, had gone silent after 11 o'clock on the night of October 12th, a Sunday. But the carrier records told a more complicated story. There was a second device registered to his business account. A line that was rarely used that looked, in its structure, like what people sometimes call a burner, a phone you use when you don't want the calls attached to your name. That line had been active until 6:17 in the evening on October 13th. The last call it made was to an unregistered prepaid number that went nowhere. Mancini looked at all of this. She sat with it. She turned it over. Something smelled wrong. She just couldn't yet say what. In the meantime, the story had found its way to the internet, because these things always do, eventually, and the internet had already decided what had happened. Vivian Hargrove, people said, had killed her husband for the insurance money. Look at her composure. Look at how quickly she hired a lawyer. Look at how she won't talk to investigators a second time. Guilty people hire lawyers. Guilty people stay calm. Guilty people have explanations for everything. There were Reddit threads running hundreds of pages long. There were TikTok videos. There was, I am told, a full-length YouTube video titled Vivian Hargrove Killed Her Husband and I Can Prove It, which received several 100,000 views before it was eventually removed. She was convicted thoroughly and publicly, before a single charge had ever been filed. But Mancini, to her lasting credit, was not on the internet. She was in the office and she had begun looking at something nobody else was paying attention to. She had begun looking at the business. Hargrove Capital, on paper, was a healthy firm. 40-odd private clients, wealthy individuals, small family offices, one regional pension fund, earning solid, consistent returns year after year. Richard was the face of it, the rainmaker, the man whose instincts had built the thing from nothing. Stuart Fenn handled the machinery, the compliance, the operations, the paperwork that kept a financial firm running and legal and properly reported to the relevant authorities. Mancini and her partner, Detective Ray Okafor, began going through the SEC filings. Slowly, carefully. And there, buried in the numbers, they found something strange. Certain client accounts showed returns that were almost exactly consistent. The same percentage quarter after quarter, regardless of what the market was doing. Markets don't behave like that. Markets breathe. They rise and fall and surprise everyone, including people who have spent their entire lives studying them. A return that never varies is not a sign of exceptional management. It is a sign that something else is happening. Mancini brought in a financial crimes consultant named Patricia Ewan. She handed Ewan the books and told her to take her time. Ewan called back 3 days later. She used 2 words. It's layered. What she had found, beneath the surface of Hargrove Capital's apparently healthy operation, was a shadow structure. A second layer of accounts, registered through 2 shell companies incorporated in Delaware, receiving small, regular transfers from client funds and routing them outward. Not to Richard's personal accounts. Not to anything obviously connected to Hargrove Capital or anyone who worked there. To accounts registered to a name Mancini had never heard. Marcus Thale. Marcus Thale was not in Richard Hargrove's phone. He was not in his emails. He was not on any client list, any employee record, any piece of documentation that touched Hargrove Capital in any visible way. What Marcus Thale did have was a history. 2 criminal convictions, wire fraud in 2004, extortion in 2011. He had served time for each. He had been released from his second sentence in 2016 and had since been living, on paper, in Newark, New Jersey. A rental apartment. An older Honda registered in his name. No employer of record. No visible means of support. Newark PD sent someone to do a welfare check. Thale wasn't home. His landlord said he hadn't seen him in roughly 3 weeks. Now Mancini had 2 missing men, a web of hidden money, and nothing that looked like a coincidence anymore. But the break, the real break, the one that cracked the case at its foundations, did not come from a database or a financial record or a surveillance camera. It came from a man named Dennis Cho. Sitting in a car in his own driveway on a Tuesday morning, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee going cold, with the weight of 2 years of silence pressing down on him like something he could no longer carry. He called Mancini's cell phone, the number off a business card she'd left during an early interview, at 7 in the morning without going through a lawyer, without rehearsing what he was going to say. He said, "I need to tell you something. I've been trying to tell someone for 2 years. I didn't know who was safe." Dennis Cho had worked with Richard Hargrove for 9 years. He was precise and conscientious in the way that good accountants are, keeping meticulous records, asking careful questions, maintaining a professional distance from the decisions of the people whose numbers he managed. But in 2017, Richard had come to him with an unusual request. He wanted help structuring what he called deferred compensation arrangements for an unnamed third party. The paperwork was deliberately vague. The amounts were not large individually, but they were regular. Cho, to his own later shame, had helped set it up. He told himself it was legal. He told himself Richard knew what he was doing. He told himself a lot of things that a man tells himself when he senses something is wrong but does not yet want to know how wrong. And then, in early 2019, something shifted. Richard came to him different. Not in any way that would be obvious to a stranger, but Cho had known him for 9 years and he saw it. The distraction. The way his eyes moved when he sat down like he was checking the room. The small, careful pauses before he answered even simple questions. He told Cho, in fragments over 2 separate conversations, that the arrangements had gotten complicated. That someone was not holding up their end of something. That he was trying to find a way out. Cho asked, "Out of what?" Richard looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "I found something I shouldn't have found. And now I can't unfind it." He said nothing more. Cho didn't push. For months later, Richard was gone. "I found something I shouldn't have found." Mancini and Okafor sat with those words for a long time. Turned them over. Held them up to the light. That is not the language of a man who is planning to disappear. It is not the language of a man who is moving money into a storage unit somewhere and quietly engineering an exit from his own life. It is not in any way the language of guilt. It is the language of fear. And it pointed them somewhere new, not at Vivian, not at Richard's personal finances, not at any of the threads the internet was busy pulling from the wrong end. It pointed them at Stuart Fenn. And at a storage facility in Newark, New Jersey, where a unit registered to a Delaware shell company had gone 3 months without its monthly fee being paid, and where the facility manager had finally flagged the delinquent account to local police, whose check of the entity name had quietly pinged an active federal inquiry. Because by this point, 6 months after Richard vanished, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division had opened a parallel investigation into Hargrove Capital. And when the Bureau and the state police compared notes, and when a warrant was obtained, and when 2 investigators in latex gloves rolled open the door of that storage unit in Newark on a gray Wednesday afternoon in spring, they found 4 bankers' boxes of financial records. A password-protected laptop. A prepaid cell phone, dead but recoverable. And a letter. Sealed in a plain white envelope. Addressed, in Richard Hargrove's careful, deliberate handwriting, to Detective Sergeant Carol Mancini, Connecticut State Police. He had known. Somewhere in the long, frightened months of 2019, Richard Hargrove had understood that he was running out of time. And so he had done the only thing left to him, he had built a record. Box by careful box, document by document, he had assembled everything he had gathered over 2 years of quiet, terrified watching. And he had written a letter to a detective who did not yet exist. A placeholder. A message in a bottle addressed to whoever, eventually, came looking. The letter was 4 pages. Handwritten, in the precise, measured script of a man who has decided that clarity matters more now than it ever has before. It told the full story. In 2017, while reviewing a routine portfolio reconciliation, Richard had discovered that Stuart Fenn, his partner, his colleague of more than a decade, the man who handled the operational backbone of everything they had built together, had been systematically skimming money from client accounts. Not greedily, not in the obvious way that gets caught quickly, but steadily. Small percentages. Well disguised, routed through the shell structure into the hands of Marcus Thale, not as a beneficiary but as a conduit. Thale knew how to move money. How to make trails go cold. He had done it before. Richard confronted Fenn. And Fenn, rather than denying it, made him a counteroffer. The money, Fenn told him, was not going into Fenn's own pocket. It was paying a debt. A specific, old, dangerous debt, owed to people he described only as not the kind you can ghost. He told Richard that if the scheme were exposed, the fallout would destroy them both. He told him, calmly, quietly, the way you say something you have rehearsed many times, that if Richard went to the authorities, he would not live to see a trial. Richard went home that night and did not sleep. And then he made a decision that I find, the more I think about it, quietly extraordinary. He decided not to run. Not to confront. Not to go to the authorities in any obvious way that might get back to Fenn before the evidence was safe. Instead, he started building. Every transfer he could document, he documented. Every communication, every piece of the structure he could access. He copied it, printed it, added it to the boxes in the storage unit he'd rented under a name that wasn't his, in a city that wasn't where he lived, paying the monthly fee in cash. He wrote the letter last. September 28, 2019, 16 days before he disappeared. And then, in early October, something changed. He discovered that his own name had been quietly added to the registered agent list of one of Fenn's shell companies, without his knowledge, without his consent. Whoever was behind this had decided that when the structure eventually collapsed, Richard Hargrove was going to be the one left holding it. He wasn't just a witness anymore. He had been framed. Through the burner phone, through the unregistered prepaid number that Mancini had traced and never been able to place, he had made contact with a federal agent. He was trying to arrange a proffer. A deal. He would hand over everything in exchange for protection. The meeting was scheduled for October 14, 2019. The morning Dolores Reyes arrived at 7:15 and found the bed already made. Richard had made the bed because he got up early. Because he was getting dressed and thinking about what he was going to say, and walking out the front door toward a meeting that he believed, he had to believe, was going to be the beginning of the end of all of it. He never made it. Marcus Thale was located 8 months later in Phoenix, Arizona, living quietly under a different name. He was arrested on federal charges, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy in connection with Richard Hargrove's disappearance. He cooperated. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he gave investigators the testimony they needed, implicating Stuart Fenn and at least 2 others in what federal prosecutors described as a coordinated effort to silence Richard before he could reach the people he was trying to reach. Stuart Fenn was arrested in March of 2021. He sat at the defendant's table in a federal courtroom looking, by every account, like a man who had believed until the very last moment that he was too careful to be caught. Richard Hargrove's body has never been found. He is classified legally as a homicide victim. But without remains, without the final chapter of his physical story, there is a piece of this that will never be fully told. And Vivian, the woman the internet convicted, the woman who had anonymous letters left in her mailbox and cameras outside her home and 2 years of strangers certain they knew exactly what she had done, Vivian was cleared of everything. Every theory about her was wrong. Every accusation, every thread, every I can prove it video wrong. She gave one interview in 2022 to a print journalist. She sat across from the reporter in a quiet restaurant and spoke in the measured, careful way of someone who has learned, through great pain, to choose their words with precision. She said, "Richard spent 2 years trying to protect me from something I didn't even know existed. And for 2 more years after he was gone, people decided I was the monster. I don't have words for what that's like." She sold the estate. She moved somewhere quiet. Nobody knows exactly where, and I think that is entirely as it should be. I think about Richard Hargrove often. I think about the man from Bridgeport who built something from nothing, who understood numbers the way some people understand music, who brought orange slices to Little League on Saturday mornings because somewhere inside him, the boy who had wanted to belong never entirely grew up. I think about him sitting alone at a table, in the autumn of 2019, writing 4 pages of careful truth by hand. Addressing them to a detective whose name he hadn't learned yet. Sealing the envelope. Carrying it to the storage unit in Newark, setting it on top of the boxes and driving home. He did not know if those pages would ever be found. He could not know. He was building something in the dark, in secret, on faith alone. Faith that if he left a record someone would eventually come looking. Someone careful enough, patient enough, allergic enough to coincidence. He was right. There is something in that, in the quiet, determined act of leaving a record when you are afraid and alone and running out of time, that I find more moving than I know how to say. He couldn't save himself. But he could tell the truth. He could make sure that when someone came looking, they would find what they needed to find. That's not strategy. That's not legal maneuvering. That is a man deciding, in the last days he has, that truth matters more than almost anything else. That leaving it behind, clearly, carefully, addressed to someone who would know what to do with it, is the most important thing he can do. He was right. It just cost him everything. If you stayed with me through all of this, thank you. Genuinely. If you're new here, subscribe. There are more stories where this one came from, stories of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, of evidence left in unlikely places, of truth finding its way through even the most carefully constructed darkness. Leave a comment. Tell me what stayed with you.